A stranger has been staring at my balcony and crying every single night at 9:17 p.m. And when I finally confronted him, I realized somehow he knows me even though I've never seen him before. I never believed life could change in a single minute. Yet here I am remembering the exact time that changed everything for me, 9:17 p.m., not 9, not 9:15, not even 9:30, but always 9:17. As if the universe itself had set an alarm that only one man obeyed, because every night without fail he stood across the street from my apartment building and looked up at my balcony with eyes full of something I could never quite understand until later. And every time I checked the clock, it was always exactly 9:17 p.m. Like precision was part of his grief, or maybe part of his devotion. I don't know yet. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I mean, I live in a pretty crowded neighborhood. Weird things happen all the time, and I'm a 26-year-old woman living alone, and I can't afford to freak out over every stranger on the street. So I ignored him. I told myself he wasn't looking at me. He wasn't thinking about me, and maybe he wasn't even crying. Maybe the streetlights were just reflecting weirdly off his face, or maybe he just had allergies. I kept convincing myself of something harmless because the alternative was too frightening to consider. But it kept happening night after night, always. 9:17. I would hear footsteps stop outside, then a long silent pause. Then I would look down from the balcony and see him with his head slightly tilted up, tears sliding down his cheeks, and he never made a sound. He never waved. He never said a word. He would just cry quietly, and then when the minute passed, he would walk away almost like a ghost returning to wherever ghosts go when their time is up. And every time I watched him, my skin prickled with something that was not fear, but also not comfort. Something in between. Something like being remembered by someone you've never met. It bothered me so much that I stopped going outside on purpose. I started closing the curtains early, pretending I was busy, pretending I didn't care. But curiosity is a stubborn creature. It crawls into your head when you're tired, and it sits next to you when you're eating, and it taps you on the shoulder at night when everything is too quiet, and eventually it wins. So one night, instead of going inside early, I stepped onto my balcony and waited. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. And at exactly 9:17, his footsteps echoed down the street, and he stopped under my balcony and lifted his head, and I saw his face clearly. For the first time, his eyes looked broken, but hopeful, in a way that made my heart ache without reason. And he looked right at me as if he knew I would be there, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than I had been alive. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. He wasn't surprised to see me. He looked relieved, and I didn't know whether to run inside or ask him who he was. So I just stood there, frozen, staring back at a stranger who cried for me without words, without explanation, without permission, and somehow without being wrong. If you were in my place and a stranger cried under your balcony every single night at the exact same time, would you confront him immediately or hide and pretend nothing was happening? I don't know what kind of strength or recklessness pushed me forward, but when I saw him that night standing there with tears on his cheeks and relief in his eyes, I found myself gripping the balcony railing and whispering down to him before I could stop myself. Who are you, and why are you here, and why do you keep looking up at my balcony every night? And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt a shiver of regret, as if I had just opened a door that was never meant to be opened. He didn't answer right away. He didn't even seem shocked by the fact that I finally acknowledged him. Instead, he slowly wiped his face with the back of his hand, took one step closer, and looked up at me with a kind of softness that made my breath catch and said, "I promised someone I would come here," and that was it. That was the only answer he gave, and it made absolutely no sense to me. Because a promise to who? A promise for what? Why my balcony? Why this exact time, every night? And why did he look at me like he knew me? Like he had known me forever? I told him I don't understand, and he nodded, like he expected that reaction, like he had rehearsed it, and he whispered, "I didn't expect you to yet," and there was something about the way he said yet that made my stomach twist, because it suggested there was something I was supposed to know. Something I was supposed to remember, something that belonged to both of us, even though we had never met, and I swear I had never seen this man before in my life. I asked him again, "Who did you promise?" And this time he closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory hurt him, then opened them again and said, "Someone who loved you more than his own life." And I felt a jolt of fear run through me, because I have lost people I've loved. I have family that is gone, but none of them ever mentioned anything about a stranger, or a promise, or a destiny tied to an apartment balcony, and certainly not a man crying every night. Then I asked the question that had been clawing inside my mind since the very first night, "Do you know me?" And he didn't hesitate, not even for a second. Yes, and that single word was both comforting and horrifying, because I didn't know him, but he knew me, and he said it, like it was a fact, like it was unchangeable, like it always had been that way. "How do you know me?" I asked, and that was the first time his voice broke when he replied, "You don't remember me." And when he said that, my heart dropped. Because it didn't feel like some manipulative line, it felt like a truth that hurt him deeply, almost like my forgetfulness was a wound he carried. I told him, "I have never met you. I would remember you." And he shook his head gently. "No, you wouldn't, because you weren't meant to remember, not yet." And before I could ask anything else, he stepped back as if his minute had expired, checked his watch, saw 9:18, then whispered goodnight and walked away, leaving me standing there in silence with more fear than answers, more curiosity than comfort, more connection than logic. And I didn't sleep that night, not even for a second, because something inside me knew this was just the beginning. If someone told you, "You don't remember me," with complete confidence, would you try to find the truth or distance yourself immediately? I woke up the next morning with the kind of exhaustion that sits heavier than sleep, because my mind had replayed every second of last night, again and again and again, the stranger, his voice, his eyes, the way he said, "You don't remember me," like it was a tragedy and not a mystery. And even though I tried to ground myself in things that made sense, brushing my teeth, making coffee, scrolling my phone, none of it worked. Because my mind kept circling the same question. Who was he to me? All day I kept telling myself I shouldn't care, that I should call the police, or tell the building security, or tell a friend. But I didn't do any of that because something in his voice, something in his pain, something in his certainty wouldn't let me take the easy way out. I wasn't scared of him. Not truly. I was scared of why he knew me, scared of what I didn't remember, scared of what part of my life he belonged to. That night, I told myself I wouldn't go to the balcony. I told myself I'd lose interest if I just ignored him, but the clock betrayed me. Every minute felt heavier as it got closer to 9. I could barely sit still. And the moment the clock reached 9:16, I was already standing behind my curtains, pretending I wasn't waiting, even though I was holding my breath like someone about to dive into deep, dark water. At 9:17, I heard the footsteps again. He stopped just like before, and even though I didn't step out, I watched through the curtain, and this time, he wasn't crying right away. He was smiling faintly, as if he already knew I was there. Watching him pretending not to watch, and after a few seconds, he whispered without looking up, "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here because I owe you everything." I stepped out onto the balcony slowly, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was too curious to stay hidden. And he looked up like he had been waiting, and I said, "Tell me what I did. Tell me why you're here." And he shook his head gently, like he was trying to protect me from something too heavy, and said, "Not yet. If I tell you too early, you will hate the truth and lose the gift your memory gave you." I didn't understand any of it, but I could feel he wasn't lying, and I could feel that whatever connected us wasn't small or accidental. It was big, it was painful, it was important, and I hated that part of me wanted to trust him because trust shouldn't come this easily. Not with strangers, not with mysteries. I asked him for one thing, then just one thing to prove we had really met before. And his expression changed completely. His eyes softened and he whispered something that made every bone in my body freeze. "You used to sit on this balcony and talk to the stars? Every night, and every time you did, you saved my life a little more?" I didn't breathe for several seconds because no one is supposed to know. That no one is supposed to know about the version of me that only existed when the world was asleep. No one ever heard those conversations. Not my friends, not my family, not even people I used to love. That part of me belonged only to silence. And yet a stranger knew it, which means maybe he wasn't a stranger at all. If someone knew a secret about you that you've never told anyone, would you trust them more or fear them more? I don't know if it was shock or recognition or fear that kept me from running inside when he said that about me talking to the stars, but there was something inside my chest that shifted like a lock clicking into place. A memory not fully returning, but stirring like something that had been asleep for years and didn't want to wake up yet. And I looked down at him and asked quietly, "How could you know that nobody ever heard me? Nobody ever saw me?" And he smiled a sad, gentle smile and said, "I did because back then, I needed someone to remind me that life was still worth staying for. And you did that without ever knowing you were doing it." My throat tightened. I didn't know what to say because it was overwhelming to be told you saved a life without even knowing it. Overwhelming to think your existence had mattered to someone you didn't even remember, and the way he looked at me wasn't romantic or obsessive. It was grateful and broken, like he had been carrying something heavy for far too long. Then he said something that made my heart feel like it was falling. "I used to live in this building, and I used to come home every night ready to give up on everything. And every time I reached that point, I would hear your voice on this balcony talking to the stars about pain and hope and growing up and the way life hurts. But you still keep going, and you never knew I was listening, but I was. And every night your words kept me alive one more day." I felt tears sting my eyes because I didn't know whether to feel touched or terrified or guilty. I didn't remember him. I didn't remember any of that. I didn't even remember talking to anyone but the sky. And I whispered, "I'm sorry, I don't remember you." And he shook his head. Immediately, "Don't apologize. You weren't meant to remember. This was mine to carry, not yours." And there was something so sincere in the way he said that it broke me a little. But one thing still didn't make sense, so I asked him if I helped you. "Why are you crying now?" And he looked away. Like the question hurt because now I look up here and see you. But you're different. You're here, but the version of you who saved me is gone. And that version loved this balcony more than anything in the world, and now you only come here because of me, and I don't want that. It was the way he said that finally made me understand something. He wasn't coming here for himself anymore. He was coming here for me because he didn't want me to lose the part of myself that once saved him. He wasn't crying because of what he remembered. He was crying because of what I had forgotten. Before I could say anything, he checked his watch again. 9:18, and he whispered not goodbye but thank you. And then he turned and walked away, leaving me with a feeling so heavy it felt like it was sitting on my lungs, because for the first time since this whole thing began, I didn't want him to leave, and I realized how dangerous that feeling was. Do you think a person from your past, someone you barely remember, can still hold a big place in your life today? I told myself I wouldn't go to the balcony the next night, that I should break whatever this was before it dug any deeper into me. But of course, the clock hit 9 o'clock, and I was already pacing around my living room like someone waiting for a phone call. They swore they didn't care about, and by 9:10, I was standing in the dark behind my balcony door watching the street with my heart racing, like I wasn't in control of my own body anymore. At 9:17, he appeared again, like always 1 minute early, like he had trained his whole life to arrive precisely on time, and he stood in the exact same spot, head tilted up, eyes searching for me, even though I was still hidden. And I don't know what possessed me. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear, maybe something that was starting to feel like longing. But instead of stepping outside onto the balcony, I did something reckless, something that I still don't know if I regret or if I'm grateful for. I grabbed my sweater, slipped on my shoes, rushed down the stairs, and stepped out onto the sidewalk behind him, quietly watching him the same way he had watched my balcony for nights. And when he finally turned and saw me standing there on the street, he looked stunned, like he never imagined I would come down. Not because he didn't want me to, but because he didn't want to pull me into his pain. I walked toward him slowly and said, "I don't want to talk from far away anymore." and something about the way his shoulders relaxed in relief told me he had been waiting for that sentence longer than he should have, and he whispered, "Are you sure?" And I answered with a nod that felt heavier than words. We walked without speaking for a while, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was calm, like something inside both of us recognized the other, even if memory didn't. And after a few minutes, he stopped in front of a quiet park and sat on a bench. And I sat beside him and asked the question that had been burning inside me since the night this began. Why didn't you ever talk to me all those nights when you needed someone? Why stay hidden? He stared straight ahead at the dark, empty playground and said, "Because I could barely keep myself alive back then, and I didn't want to take anything from you. You were the only good thing I had, and I didn't want my pain to touch you." And hearing that made my chest ache in a way I didn't know how to describe, because it was too sweet and too sad and too much all at the same time. Then he said quietly, "I promised myself that when I got better, I would come back here not to ask for anything, just to thank you for saving me." And maybe that could have been the end of it. Maybe it would have stayed simple if he had stopped there, but he continued in a voice softer than a memory every time I came back and saw the balcony empty. "I missed you without ever having known you." That sentence hit me so deeply that I couldn't breathe for a moment, because I didn't understand how someone could miss a person. They never spoke to someone. They barely knew someone they weren't supposed to know at all. I turned to him and whispered, "I don't even know your name." And he smiled like he was embarrassed to have forgotten something basic, and finally said, "Ethan," and my name felt small in my mouth when I replied, "Mine's Lila too." Strangers, one past a connection neither of us fully understood, and something inside me telling me this story was nowhere near finished. Would you follow someone to learn the truth, even if you fear the truth might change your life forever? I wished I could say everything got better after that night, but it didn't, because the more I tried to forget him, the more every part of my life found a way to bring him back to me, like my heart had become a stage where every memory of him performed again and again without permission, and I was trapped in the front row watching helplessly. I began avoiding places he loved. I stopped wearing the colors he always complimented. I stopped listening to songs he once sang to me without realizing that every time I tried to erase him, I was actually carving him deeper into my soul. And it was exhausting, because loving someone silently is heavier than any heartbreak that comes with goodbye. One evening, while I was returning from work, the weather suddenly shifted. The wind turned cold and the sky darkened. And before I could find shelter, rain began to pour, the kind of rain that forces you to feel the weight you are carrying. And with each raindrop, I felt everything I had been holding back rising inside me, and I walked without caring that I was getting soaked or that my tears were flowing just as fast, because for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that even though he was no longer mine, my heart still belonged to him. When I reached my apartment lobby, I almost slipped because I froze. I saw him standing there completely drenched, as if he had been waiting for me for hours. His hair wet, his shirt clinging to his body, his chest rising and falling with desperation. And the moment our eyes met, something inside me shattered and rebuilt at the same time, because I had never seen him look so fragile, so scared, so human. He stepped closer slowly, as though afraid I might disappear, and he whispered my name, and I felt my whole world melt, the sound of it coming from him again. Felt like home and disaster and salvation all together, and I couldn't breathe because every emotion I had buried came rushing back like a tidal wave I was not prepared for. He told me he tried to live without me. He really tried. He thought convincing himself I was better off without him was the right thing to do, but he was wrong, and he finally realized it. And he said, every good moment felt incomplete. Every success felt empty. Every dream felt dull because I wasn't there. And he couldn't shut his heart, no matter how hard he fought it. I stood there trembling, wanting to run into his arms and wanting to run away at the same time, because I didn't know if this was finally love returning or pain repeating, and I hated that I still cared so deeply after everything. And then he said it, the words that made my world stop. "If loving you is a mistake, then I am ready to live a lifetime of mistakes." My chest tightened, my lips parted, but no words came out. I didn't know whether to surrender or protect myself, whether to forgive or fear the future. I wanted him, but I was terrified of losing myself again. As the rain continued pouring outside, both of us stood silently staring at each other, like the universe had paused just to watch what we would choose next. If you were standing in the rain with the person who once broke your heart but still owns it completely, would you run into their arms or walk away to save yourself? I don't know how long we stood there in that lobby with the rainstorm echoing outside like some dramatic soundtrack chosen by fate, but in that moment, every memory we ever shared flickered between us silently, as if our hearts were speaking faster than our words ever could. And I could feel the weight of all the unanswered questions pressing on my chest, the late-night messages we never sent, the moments we almost confessed, the smiles we almost held a little longer, the goodbyes we never meant. He stepped closer, and suddenly there was barely any space between us, and I could feel his breath trembling, like he was holding himself together with the last thread of hope. And he whispered that he was sorry, not in the casual, forgetful way people apologize, but in that broken, genuine way that only comes from realizing how much damage love can cause when someone walks away too soon. He confessed that every time he saw someone who even slightly looked like me, his heart would stop, because for a split second he thought it was me, and he admitted that he tried to keep loving me from a distance. Believing sacrifice made him a good man, but he finally understood that love is not noble when it hurts both people, and he couldn't keep pretending that letting me go was the right thing when it was destroying him slowly. The tremor in his voice cracked something inside me, and I felt my tears rise again, not from pain this time, but from the unbearable relief of being seen again, of being wanted again, of being chosen again. And yet, my fear stayed like a shadow, reminding me that love is not just magic, it is also risk, and I could not forget how much it hurt the first time I told him I wasn't the same girl anymore. I told him the version of me who loved boldly, without hesitation, died the day he left, and he nodded, like he already knew. And he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to justify anything. He only said he wanted the chance to meet the woman I have become, even if she is guarded, even if she is afraid, even if she is uncertain, because he still chooses her. My voice cracked when I said I didn't know if I could trust him, and he simply replied that he didn't expect me to trust him instantly, that all he wanted was the chance to earn what he once threw away. And his eyes softened with something I couldn't resist: love, but patient love, love that doesn't demand love that waits. In that small lobby with rain dripping from our clothes and our hearts hanging naked between us, I realized something important. Sometimes love doesn't disappear when it breaks. Sometimes it hides until both people are brave enough to try again. I took one step toward him, just one, and he closed his eyes like that. Single step meant everything to him, and maybe it did, because suddenly I felt the air shift, the possibility of healing, the possibility of rebuilding. And even though my fear didn't vanish, my hope finally spoke louder. If someone returned to you, not asking for instant forgiveness, but asking for the chance to earn your trust back, would you give them that chance or protect yourself, even if it meant losing them forever? The next night, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight out onto my balcony as the clock ticked closer to 9:17 p.m. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't pretending. I was ready to face whatever this connection had meant all these years and maybe finally take a step into something I had been too cautious to allow before. And the street below was empty, except for him standing there looking up at me with a small, hesitant smile, like he couldn't believe I was really out here choosing to stay. I called his name softly, and his head snapped up as if a weight I couldn't see had lifted from his shoulders, and I realized how much he must have carried alone all these nights, all those minutes staring up at a balcony and waiting for someone he barely knew to appear for him. And yet he never complained, never demanded, never begged. He just endured silently until the right moment came, and maybe that moment was tonight. He looked at me and whispered, "Lila," and I felt my heart skip a beat because even saying my name now held 1,000 layers of memory and emotion, and I realized that for both of us it wasn't about remembering perfectly, it was about being willing to try again despite the gaps, despite the lost time, despite the fear. And I stepped a little closer to the edge of the balcony and he mirrored me on the street, so our distance remained fragile but somehow full of promise. We didn't speak for a long time, just breathed in the same air through the night sky, and I could feel the past mingling with the present, the little version of me who had saved him without knowing, and the grown version of me who was finally ready to acknowledge what we had both carried for so long. And suddenly I understood that love isn't always loud, it isn't always dramatic, it is often quiet. It is endurance. It is showing up even when the world says you shouldn't. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "I don't want you to forget this version of yourself, the one who unknowingly saved me, because it's the strongest part of you and maybe the bravest." And I felt tears slide down my cheeks because he was right. I had lost pieces of myself over the years. I had been careful and calculated and afraid, but now in his presence, all that carefulness melted into courage and somehow into something else entirely, something that had been waiting for both of us. We stood there until the lights of the city flickered behind him until 9:45, and still no one else appeared. And I realized that our connection was no longer one-sided. He had carried it all this time, and now I had chosen to carry it with him, and somehow that made everything feel lighter and terrifying. If someone had been waiting for you every night for years, silently watching over you, and finally gave you a choice to meet them openly, would you step forward or stay behind the safety of distance? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about him and the way his eyes held pieces of a past I didn't remember and yet somehow felt connected to. And when the sky darkened again, I found myself hoping he would appear even before 9:17 p.m. because waiting had become impossible. And the thought of not seeing him made my chest ache in a way I hadn't anticipated. And maybe that was the point of all this, the ache that demanded attention, the presence that refused to be ignored. When he finally arrived, he didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, like we both understood that words were unnecessary. Sometimes that silence carried more truth than any explanation. And I stepped out onto the balcony without hesitation this time, and I watched him as he looked up at me, and I realized I could finally see everything. Not just his face, but his exhaustion, the way he had endured all these nights alone, the hope that had never left him, and the vulnerability that made me want to protect him and trust him all at once. I said softly, "I want to understand everything. I want to know why you came here every night." And he took a deep breath and started to tell me the story of a boy who had once lost himself completely, who had wandered through life barely holding on, who had discovered the smallest fragments of hope in the most unexpected place. A voice on a balcony talking to the stars, a girl who didn't know she was saving him yet was doing it every night unknowingly, like a guardian angel with a heart bigger than he had ever imagined. And as he spoke, I realized he wasn't exaggerating or fantasizing. He was telling the truth of years spent surviving with me as his quiet reason. Tears blurred my vision because I hadn't known my own impact, because I hadn't remembered my younger self, because I hadn't realized that sometimes being kind, even when no one notices, can change the course of a life completely. And he had carried that memory even if I hadn't. And it struck me how fragile and precious we all are, and how invisible acts of love can echo for decades without our knowledge. Then he looked at me and said something that broke me and healed me at the same time. "I never forgot you, and I carried the pieces of you. I didn't know you lost along the way." And suddenly the years we hadn't spoken, the moments we hadn't shared didn't feel empty anymore. They felt like preparation for this reunion, like every pain and every fear and every lonely night had led us here to each other. I felt my chest tighten and whispered his name, and he whispered mine. And in that moment, rain began to fall again, and neither of us moved, because for once the world didn't matter, because we had finally found each other, and the past no longer held us prisoner. It had only brought us to this one perfect, impossible moment. If someone carried memories of you that you didn't even know existed, would you feel grateful or afraid of the responsibility that comes with knowing the truth? That night, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, but neither of us moved from where we stood, the world around us fading into shadows because, for the first time, everything felt like it was exactly where it was meant to be. And I looked down at him and he looked up at me, and in that gaze I saw every fear we had survived, every lonely night, Every misunderstanding, every moment we had carried without knowing we were carrying it for each other. And I realized that love doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it waits patiently until both hearts are ready to meet again. I whispered softly, I don't know what to say, and he smiled. The kind of smile that reaches the soul and said, You don't have to say anything, just be here. And in that simplicity, I felt more connection than I had in years, more trust than I ever imagined I could give anyone. And I realized that all those nights when he cried under my balcony, all those nights when I thought I was imagining things had been leading to this exact moment, when silence itself became our language, when being together without words became enough. I stepped closer to the edge and he mirrored me below. And suddenly the distance between us felt meaningless, and I reached out my hand, slowly trembling, and he took it immediately, like it was the most natural thing in the world to hold a piece of me. That had always belonged to him, and I felt the warmth of his fingers against mine, and the tension I had carried for years melt like ice under the sun, and I whispered, Your hand feels like home. And he laughed softly, a sound that held relief and joy and longing all at once. And he said, You've always been my home. We talked then quietly, finally sharing small stories and memories and laughter that made our chests ache, and for the first time, I felt a rhythm between us, not of fear, not of obligation, but of mutual understanding. A rhythm that said, we survived for a reason, that said the world may forget us, but we will never forget each other. And even if tomorrow everything changed, we would carry this night inside us forever because it was ours alone. And I realized something important that night, that love isn't always about knowing everything about the other person or about remembering every detail. It's about showing up. It's about being willing to carry someone's pain and joy as if it were your own. It's about choosing again and again to trust, even when you don't understand. And it's about letting someone in, even when it terrifies you. As the night grew darker and the city lights blinked in the distance, he looked up at me and whispered, You saved me. And I realized finally that I had never just saved him. I had found him and he had found me, and together we had found the parts of ourselves we didn't know were missing until this exact moment. I smiled through tears and whispered, I found you too. And for the first time in years, the rain felt like a blessing and the balcony felt like home. If someone from your past returned carrying your unseen impact on their life, would you let yourself fall for them again or protect yourself from being vulnerable?